Here's the classical time period. Now, back in my introduction video, I mentioned that this class is the study of Western classical music. And that word classical there applied to the entirety of music. Everything that we're talking about here is considered classical music. When we get to modern times, I won't talk about classical music because that refers to this strain of music history. Whereas in classical music history, you have a period called the classical time period. And that happened for a shorter span of time, 1750 to 1825. You notice it's about half the time that the previous two were, 75 years as compared to 150. During the classical time period, there were people that got together and they decided that there was too much stuff going on, that humanism had grown too much and it was pruned. So instead of desiring to know so much about everything, people wanted to dive deeper into just one topic. And so if you'd imagine a bush, this bush would grow in the Baroque time period, and there would be all kinds of shoots popping out every which way. A classical musician and a classical person would want to come to that bush and prune it and make it just a nice presentable square, maybe a circle, carve it into a giraffe, who knows. But they would want to form it in such a way that it wasn't just crazy and it wasn't poking out everywhere. And so musically that was reflected in that they made only one melody, and that was the most important thing. There was something called the Florentine Camerata, which was basically a meeting of some of the biggest musical minds of the time, and they got together and they essentially created the modern opera. An opera in the fact that there is a singer on stage and they have an orchestra accompanying them, but the most important thing was the sung word. And so to be understood as you sang was going to be the most important thing. And so that's where opera went. It was a singer on stage and you would sing your line with the melody being clearly understood and a basic simple accompaniment underneath. So with our picture, you notice that it is very much more realistic, and it is super. Again, it's kind of simple. If this were a Baroque painting, there would be all kinds of stuff all over the walls, like pictures hanging or things on there. But they really contrast the shadows in this one. It's very dark in the corners, but the light from the window really lights up. And then it's just a woman potentially, in a kitchen or at a table pouring some milk into a jar, something like that. But it's incredibly detailed, like that bread. It looks very lifelike. You could reach in and actually eat that. So classical, taking very rich things, but making it very much more smaller and reduced. And here's our song from Mozart. You probably will recognize this song. You're going to see where the accompaniment is, and then you'll hear the melody over the top of that very, very clearly. You can even see that reflected in the music. You know exactly where the melody is and what the accompaniment is as well. And that's a classical time period. We'll move on to the Romantic time period. Be careful that you don't think of loves and hugs and kisses with this. Romantic here instead, from 1825 to 1900, is about the music of emotion. And they started to understand and write music that would tug on your heartstrings and make you feel certain things. Young kids would always joke about when I play songs that are romantic, they would say, "Who died? Like somebody, this sounds like it belongs at a funeral." And I'm like, no, it's supposed to make you feel emotion. Not everything is sad. Could make you feel happy too. So the spirit of longing, we're going to listen to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. You're really going to hear that tension. It builds up like you're needing to get somewhere. You're longing for something, but you don't necessarily arrive maybe until the end of the song. This painting here is very unique. You probably understand that we have portrait photos and we have landscape photos. And if you're taking a portrait, it's up and down, and it's only of a person. A landscape, on the other hand, you want to have it side to side so it's wider and you can see more of the landscape. This picture is not a portrait, even though there is a man in it, but instead it's really a picture of the landscape. You don't see this person very clearly, but you get the sense that there's more to the picture outside of the lines of the boundary where they painted it. And so you can't see this person's face, and so you're left to ponder what he's thinking. Maybe he's out of breath because he climbed, or maybe he has been here for a while, had a picnic, and he's just like ruminating on clouds, or who knows. But it's very mysterious. It's meant for you to think a bit more about what is actually in this painting. And there's more for you, the listener, or the viewer of this painting, and viewer or listener in romantic music. There's more for you to ponder and listen, and it's up to you to interpret. So here is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Listen for the tension, feel that emotion and that spirit of longing in this song. So we'll stop it there. I finally found a resolution point where it felt like the song could have been over, but oftentimes they actually don't get there. So feel free to listen to more of the Moonlight Sonata. It's a beautiful piece, about 7 minutes long, not a waste of your time. So we'll move on. And this is the most modern musical era, 20th century. Of course, now we're in the 21st century, and so they just blend those two together, 20th, 21st century. And from the 1900s to the present, this is the time essentially where anything goes. Music took a sudden turn. There were a couple composers who understood the progression of music and how it had progressed from medieval chant time periods into the modern time. And they thought that music was now at a time where they would take it to a brand new place. Because during the 20th century was when we actually really took musical history serious and having categories for everything that happened in the past. And so once we started to understand history, there were composers that said, well, what's next for history? It must be this. And they went in this odd direction. Serialism is a type of composing, a compositional style, where you would have a melody, or it's kind of two different things. You have a melody that goes in certain intervals and certain lengths, and then you would take it and you would essentially make it go backwards. And so if your last note was a G and your first note was a C, you would switch that around. Now your first note was a G and then it was a C, and you'd put those phrases right next to each other. So instead of having two that were the same, you'd have them two that would be opposite. And then you would take another one and you would invert it. So instead of going down from a C to a G, you would go up from a G to a C, and you would invert all those things. You would also do something called atonalism, which is actually a song we're going to listen to. Atonalism is something that just doesn't, like, it. There's no do. There's no home base, no home key. What you do is essentially you understand that there are 12 notes in a in a key. So you have like a C, or if I do it in do, there's like do and D and re and re, or there's C, C sharp, and D, D sharp, and there's 12 of those before you get back to the C. And in your melody, you would have to use each one of those only once. You could create your own rhythm, but you would have to use a C, and then at some point a C sharp, and then at some point a D, and you could only use a note again. You could only repeat it when you've used all 12. And that's just a really interesting and weird way of starting to compose. And this is the time also with that last point there, it involves many diverging traditions. There are a lot of things that people started to do as well. They tried to resurrect classical music or Baroque music, and we called it neoclassical, where people would compose in the style of this composer or in the style of that time period. And so music at this point just starts to branch out, whereas before the 20th century, it was pretty much mainstream. Like you had different pockets. You had, French music and Russian music and that kind of thing. But at this point, it really started to diverge and go crazy. So here is a song by Arnold Schoenberg, who was an American Mostly, I think. I think he may have been born in a different country. You'll have to figure that out. I can't think off the top of my head. He is one on your composer list. And this is an atonal song. You're going to see a ton of sharps and flats. You're not going to feel like the song ever finishes or has any sense of like just like going to home. Like it kind of jars you at all points. Here it is. May have to turn up your speakers for this, sorry. So there you go. Let's go back and talk about our picture here. This is a Picasso, and I'm not an art historian, but it seems like it could be like the Wicked Witch of the West or something. Kind of like a green tone. She's got like a witch's hat on there. There's also like a black cat above her right shoulder. And Picasso, is just a very different painter. He paints from different perspectives all the time. So look at her face, for example. You will see that her face is painted from two different perspectives. On one hand, you get a perspective that's straight on. So you notice that her mouth is in the center of her head. She has one eye, that's where it should be, slightly towards the side. But then as you turn to the side, you're going to see that her nose is actually painted in profile. Her ear is in the center of her head, also painted in profile. The one eye is looking off in that direction. So she's painted from both this perspective, looking straight on, and from the side. And so painting things from different perspectives, playing with angles and those kinds of things, very much represents what happens in music at that time too. Just kind of going off kilter, all of a sudden it's not realistic anymore. And they kind of do just some odd things. So that's a broad overview of musical eras, musical time periods. I have a quick slide here that just kind of gives a quick overview. And you'll see chant/medieval, very simple. Renaissance, what humans liked, that's mostly because they started to write music for everyday people, not just in the church. And as the printing press and the Renaissance happened with the rebirth of Greek culture, they wanted to be educated, learning how to read and write, perform music. Baroque, it flourished, a lot of stuff going on at once. Classical music, they decided it kind of got out of hand, and they decided to get back to the basics. Romantic, sounds of emotion. And then 20th century, which we just listened to, was anything goes. So your job at this point is to look at one of those. Honestly, just go to a Wikipedia page that talks about these and read some more. You're probably going to want to pick something from the most composers are in Baroque, Classical, Romantic, the ones that you probably know about. What I'm going to do here over the next week or so is post several more videos like this that go a bit deeper into other composers. So I'm going to talk about Bach. I'm going to talk about Beethoven, Mozart, Debussy, I think, is on there. Gershwin, just to name a few. So if you want something to be a bit easier for yourself, you can pick one of those composers to research. If you want to make this a bit more difficult and learn a bit more on your own, then you can choose one of those composers that I do not talk about. So that is how I can, you guys can pick your difficulty with this. So if I get a bunch of papers about Beethoven, because that's the one we're familiar with, that's fine. But I'd encourage you to just figure out, if you have more time, like go talk about Schoenberg. Like that would be crazy and fun. And you'd learn a lot in that process, and I'd love to help you out with that. So go do a little bit of research and pick one of these time periods. Go to that list, and then over the next week I'll be posting some videos about some of the composers. Feel free to email me questions, talk to others. I might have some other discussions that I post. I'd like you to post what you're going to do and that kind of thing. And we'll see how this goes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around next time.